It began with a sweeping drug raid in a small Texas town.
I'm glad that we got most of the drug dealers off the street.
But soon there were troubling questions.
Absolutely no backup, no wire, no recording, no surveillance, no photograph, no nothing.
A local story that took on national significance.
You began to wonder how many of these cases are really tainted.
And a team of dedicated investigators struggled to find the truth.
We did what the district attorney should have done before he prosecuted one damn case. We went and investigated what happened.
This is a story about the collapse of the criminal justice system in a place called Tulia, Texas.
Were they really guilty or simply railroaded in Texas?
Imagine this. You are asleep in your bed in the early morning hours. Suddenly, police in flak jackets and hoods come in and arrest you. They charge you with a crime you didn't commit. The only evidence against you is the word of one man, but the jury convicts you anyway. Not here, not in America. Well, you're wrong. Tonight, come on a journey with us to a small town you've probably never heard of, but should have. A place called Tulia, Texas.
On July 23rd, 1999, the early morning quiet in Tulia, Texas was shattered as lawmen from around the Texas Panhandle descended on what had always seemed to be the law-abiding seat of rural Swisher County. In a lightning drug raid, police officers and sheriff's deputies surrounded houses, swooped around corners, and made mass arrests in a stunning display of force. For some, the images of lawmen in body armor and even hoods escorting black suspects to jail evoked memories of a different era. It seemed like a made-for-television event as a ragtag parade of reputed dealers and drug kingpins walked the Perp Walk.
What people saw on the news that night was maybe a dozen people being hauled across the courthouse lawn. Many of them were half-dressed, their hair uncombed, they were cuffed.
The sweep appeared to be a staggering success, and with more than 30 people arrested that day, the local jail even ran out of room. The overflow was sent to neighboring counties and towns as far away as Amarillo. That day, the good citizens of Tulia, Texas, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief.
We hate in this community that there were 46 people that were selling drugs, but and probably substantially more than that selling drugs in the community.
Most of the people said, boy, I'm glad that we got most of the drug dealers or drug sellers off the street. Maybe they won't infiltrate into our school and sell it to our kids.
It wouldn't make the network news that day, or for many days to come.
It amounted to about 10% of the entire black population in Tulia. Extraordinary event. Should have been national headlines in the beginning, whether the people were guilty or not. Just the idea that this raid had occurred should have been big news.
Tulia, Texas, a farm town of 5,000, where most people simply struggle to survive. It hardly seemed a hotbed of drug activity, and there certainly were no signs of the fast money that comes with the illegal drug trade.
Tulia is definitely not what it used to be, and the reason is the same reason for any small town that relies on agriculture. No matter how hard they work, they just can't make the same kind of living that their parents made in agriculture.
While drugs were not an obvious part of the Tulia landscape, religion was and is. With more than 20 churches serving its small population,
I was 31 years old.
Cowboy preachers minister at Wednesday night suppers, and those looking for a stiff drink, or even a beer, better go elsewhere. Tulia's a dry town.
We're certainly rural, and we're certainly not as sophisticated as some, and we're thankful for that.
I like Tulia. It's a quiet town. You don't have to worry about the drive-by and people breaking in your house and stuff like that. So I don't want to live anywhere else.
Apparently, Sheriff Larry Stewart, Tulia's top cop, saw another side of his town. In the mid-1990s, he became convinced that trouble was lurking in the shadows of Tulia's back streets. The scourge of illegal drugs.
People that live in communities that don't think they have a drug problem in their community probably have their head stuck in the sand. And Tulia is no different.
Everybody in town pretty well knows that there's certain hangouts where there's drugs going on.
A small block of public housing occupied largely by black families had frequently been described by locals as a center of drug activity. An area next to a convenience store was another. So in late 1997, Sheriff Stewart took his first step to rid Tulia of its drug problem. He began working with the Regional Panhandle Narcotics Task Force to set up an undercover drug sting. An undercover agent, whose face was unknown in Tulia, was assigned to man the operation, alone.
I was deep undercover. Nobody knew where I was or who I was, not even the police.
Agent Tom Coleman was young, enthusiastic, and certainly seemed eager to make a name for himself. Coleman wanted his first undercover assignment to be his big break, and he took to it with almost religious zeal.
If you're going to be a cop and identify people, you're going to have to know what you're doing, because you're going to put them in jail for a long time for selling narcotics.
He assumed the alias of T.J. Dawson and basically went to work in Tulia, tried to live down there, and tried to work his way into the drug culture.
Mr. Coleman was told when he came into the county to go wherever his investigation led him. No one was off limits.
Coleman began by finding work in a busy place, Tulia Sale Barn, where cattle are auctioned weekly. That's where he met Elijah Kelly.
I was working at the sale barn, and he come out there and he applied for a job to help on Mondays, and that's how I met him.
Casey's cattle right up here down the road.
Coleman befriended Kelly, a semi-retired laborer and longtime Tulia resident. Hungry for information, the agent plied Kelly, a former alcoholic, with liquor.
And he started asking me questions about did I know where I could get some cocaine at. Oh, there was a few guys that I knew that did do it. And so that's how we got hooked up together.
According to Coleman, Kelly then became his tour guide to the seamy underside of Tulia. Coleman remained deep undercover, keeping his true identity a secret. He told Kelly he was buying drugs for girlfriends. Day and night, they cruised around town, searching for anyone who would sell them drugs. The results of Coleman's investigation appeared to be nothing short of remarkable.
They left Coleman out in the field for 18 months, during which time he claimed to have made over 150 different cocaine buys and a few marijuana buys from 46 different defendants, which in a town of 5,000 people is an incredibly impressive number.
2 or 3 times a week, he would make the 50-mile trip to Amarillo to test and then log in the drug evidence that would prove to be critical at trial. Finally, by the summer of 1999, Sheriff Stewart and DA Terry McEachern had seen enough. Thanks to Coleman, there was now enough evidence to pursue multiple convictions. The grand jury wholeheartedly agreed. They indicted 46 people on 132 separate charges of selling drugs. The prosecution's first target was Joe Moore, and his case looked like a slam dunk. Moore had a prior drug conviction, and for years had run an illegal nightclub outside of town. With Coleman's testimony and evidence, a jury convicted Moore with blinding speed. The sentence for selling 3.5 grams of cocaine, 90 years, a virtual life sentence. Other guilty verdicts quickly followed. Sentences ranged from 20 to 341 years. The clear message: if you're caught dealing drugs in Tulia, you're going to jail for a long time. Defense attorneys could do little else but try to cut deals for their clients.
I concluded that I could not win them and that the exposure to my clients was huge. We were watching verdicts come back that were just huge.
The trials and convictions continued into the year 2000. And Tom Coleman, in his first undercover investigation, had become a superstar. Already a local hero in Tulia, Coleman was honored as Texas Lawman of the Year. But soon, questions about his investigation would begin to surface from a most unlikely source. On July 23, 1999, the small Texas town of Tulia was shaken to its core. After an 18-month-long undercover investigation, more than 40 people had been indicted for selling drugs. Many in town were stunned by the scale of the roundup. But there was at least one person in Tulia who was skeptical of the arrests. Gary Gardner, a retired farmer and crop duster, is an unlikely investigator. But his gut instinct was that at least some of the defendants simply weren't smart enough to be drug dealers.
A couple of them in particular don't have the intelligence basically to keep themselves out of the weather.
Gardner has always lived in and around Tulia, and he's always asked a lot of questions. Those who like him call him earthy. Those who don't call him a troublemaker.
Me and my wife, we started investigating. Ma and Paul Kettle, they got their little tape recorder and their pad, and we started attending trials and talking to people.
What he was hearing just didn't add up. Gardner wanted to know how a town that couldn't even keep a Dairy Queen in business could support 46 drug dealers.
If each one of the 46 drug dealers has only one customer, you'd think, well, you know, somebody would be caught in possession. But what's unique in Tulia, nobody ever got caught in possession. We were extremely heavy on drug dealers, but extremely light on users.
Gardner also couldn't understand the allegation that Joe Moore was a drug kingpin. Moore, a leader in the black community, could hardly be described as living the high life.
Drug dealer, Joe Moore, the kingpin of the Tulia drug dealers. Santa Claus, the mayor of Blacktown, that's who lived here, Joe Moore. He fed hogs for a living. This is pretty well the typical Tulia drug dealer house. The stucco's falling off the walls. You go around the back side, about half the windows is knocked out. The shingles is blown off of it.
And what about Leroy Barrow? He was accused of selling Tom Coleman almost 2 grams of powder cocaine, worth about $150. But Barrow spends his days collecting cans.
That's what I do for a living, pick up cans and do all jobs. Wherever I can get my hands on, do a little work, try to make it. I don't even have electricity on this place here, but I'm happy.
I'm talking about a guy that picks up cans for a living, and he's supposed to walk around with $200 8-ball in his pocket. Didn't happen.
But Gardner was dismissed as a crank, and Barrow, after spending nearly a year in jail, decided it was too risky to face a judge and a jury. He pled guilty to a lesser charge to avoid a longer sentence.
I was just telling these people about you.
But Gardner wouldn't give up.
The first real investigation I did was 2 or 3 of the black ladies had attempted to get a copy of the indictments for everyone that was indicted, and the local district clerk refused to give them to her. And they asked me, I says, well, they got to give them to you. You just ask for them. They're open records. And I'll be darned, they wouldn't give them to me either. And that kind of triggered me as to, you know, what in the hell are we hiding if we won't let people have the public records? It took about 3 months, actually, before I got them.
Believe it or not, Gardner was the first person to look at all the evidence from all the cases together. And when he did, a clear pattern emerged that few people had noticed. Coleman had reported buying the same drug, white powder cocaine, in almost every case. To Gardner, that just didn't make sense.
Crack is the predominant drug in the black community of Tulia. The 132 indictments that I originally acquired were where it finally dawned on me that every case was for white cocaine, and it was always for what he called an 8-ball.
As the trials continued at a relentless pace, Gardner's voice seemed to be the only one raising questions about Tom Coleman's investigation. When New York Times columnist Bob Herbert heard about Tulia, what he found shocked him
The investigation was a disaster. I mean, this was not an investigation that should have been permitted. And then once you got into court, there should have been a jury who should have seen through this ridiculous, this flimsy evidence. So it became clear to me that, you know, this was a major outrage that was going on.
I didn't think I had a chance of defending a party.
Visiting with people from Coleman's past.
The attorneys turned investigators fanned out across Texas. They retraced Coleman's life and career, from Pecos County to Cochran County to Swisher County. Their mission was to find anything that would call Coleman's credibility into question.
This was a Texas odyssey, that's for sure. Just drove south, headed down to Fort Stockton, Texas, and once we got there, we had some names and phone numbers of people that we knew were people Tom Coleman had known in the past.
Pecos County was where Coleman had his first job in law enforcement, and there, investigators found signs of trouble.
He was known as a person who got himself into trouble all the time. He shot out the windshield of his patrol car in Pecos County. Perhaps most importantly, we learned that Tom had made racist comments to an officer that he rode with on a training mission.
Almost to a man, Coleman's former co-workers described him as a pathological liar. Also as a gun nut. People use words like freak, dangerous. Coleman told them stories about booby-trapping his house when he wasn't there, about this arsenal of weapons that he kept in his bathroom.
In a sworn affidavit, Coleman's ex-wife said that she had seen a Ku Klux Klan card in his wallet several times. Although he denied that race had ever played a role in the Tulia investigation, Coleman has acknowledged using racial slurs in the past.
The word n***, anybody can be a n***, okay? Just not black people, white people, anybody. I'm not prejudiced against black people or any other origin of a person.
Coleman claimed that he was forced to leave at least one job because his wife was out to get him.
She sent papers up there with a restraining order or some kind of paper to make me look bad. And one of my fellow officers that I work with called me and said, hey, we got papers for you. If you want them, come and get them. If you don't, do whatever you want. I said, okay. So I said, I ain't coming in.
Swisher County Sheriff Larry Stewart claimed to know nothing about Coleman's past and said he certainly would have investigated further if he had known about it.
I feel that we did a reasonable background on him at the time we hired him. I worked with the officers in the task force in Amarillo, and I did some interviews with some references, and I believe they did also.
But the defense team came to a different conclusion.
We know they did no background check in terms of calling anybody in Cochran County that could have given them a straight answer. They claim they left a message for the sheriff that Coleman had worked for. He didn't return the call, so instead they talked to somebody, but now they don't know who it was or when they talked to them.
Jeff Blackburn, Benita Gupta, and their team had worked overtime to compile a mountain of potentially damning material on Tom Coleman. But would it be enough to get their clients out of prison? The 1999 Tulia, Texas undercover drug raid had made Tom Coleman the golden boy of Texas law enforcement. But just 3 years later, the shine on Coleman's star was fading fast. Investigators were uncovering shocking information about his past, including a letter written by his old boss, the sheriff of Cochran County.
The sheriff put a letter in Coleman's official file with the licensing agency for law enforcement officers in Texas that said, this man ought not to be in law enforcement if he's going to do people the way he did in this town.
In 1997, Coleman was working as a deputy sheriff and had racked up almost $7,000 in debts to local merchants. Then one day, in the middle of his shift, Coleman simply left town. He tried to use a local television interview to make his case.
When I would get something, I would pull money out of my pocket and say, no, everybody runs account in all these stores here. And I said, okay, put it on the ticket. It was that way of that community. That's what they told me. I don't have to worry about it. Save it for coffee.
But the more the team dug, the more they found. It turned out that in the middle of his undercover operation in Tulia, criminal charges had been filed against Coleman in Cochran County. He was accused of having used a Cochran County credit card to fill his own car with gas when he worked there. He was charged with theft and arrested, but it was kept quiet.
They concealed the fact of his arrest. They rigged it so there wouldn't be any records made. No mugshot, no booking photos, no booking papers, no nothing. It was a super duper secret arrest.
And, it seems, prosecutors in the drug trials knew about Coleman's prior troubles, but never told anyone. And though the criminal charges against him had been dropped after Coleman repaid his debts, his arrest record would have been vitally important for defense attorneys.
We were alleging that the prosecutor in these cases had suppressed all of the evidence about Tom Coleman that he knew existed. He suppressed all of that at trial. And so no jury in Tulia ever heard anything about Tom Coleman.
There is no record of Coleman ever reporting the charges against him.
Word stood up, unfortunately, in different cases.
He had no listening device, no camera, no partner to corroborate his accusations.
We have someone from the great state of Texas here.
Meanwhile, the scandals were reverberating far beyond Tulia,
an international story, right?
Thanks to the work of activists like Randy Credico, director of the New York-based Kunstler Fund for Racial Justice.
We have stood side by side with the black community.
Yeah, I am compulsive. I get fixated on a cause. I continue. I'm not going to, because I can't leave it. I can't leave it until it's over. You know, particularly that case down there.
The number one task of the day for us was to get this story out. To not make this some nice, quiet little thing that the power structure down here could take care of and sweep under the rug. And it was Randy that stopped all that under the rug sweeping from going on.
Working with Blackburn and the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund's Vanita Gupta, Credico tried to get journalists outside of Texas interested in the story.
Jeff and I worked on this politically together by coming up with events together, press releases. I used his office as a base, basically as a PR man in that city. Like it was an advertising firm for the defendants.
How are you, Jeff?
Hi, Grandpa. How are you?
Very well.
Credico worked the media relentlessly,
Ariana Huffington,
talking to anyone who would listen.
Court TV.
One of the people who heard him was New York Times columnist Bob Herbert.
I wrote 5 or 6 columns in a row initially because I was so outraged by this. And the columns got a very strong response, and the story began to get picked up again. And I absolutely was not going to stop writing about it.
This was not just another story. As the scandal continued to unfold, the defense team began to sense victory.
None of these folks were going to let the story die. They weren't going to just turn their backs and abandon the people who were imprisoned in Texas.
In early 2003, the pressure began to pay off. The Texas Attorney General began an investigation of the Tulia arrests, and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ordered a review of the proceedings. For the Tulia 46, it seemed for the first time that an end to their nightmare might be near.
All right, I'll see you around there.
Tom Coleman had always claimed that race had not played a role in his undercover investigation. Even as revelations of his misdeeds came to light, he insisted that the Tulia arrests were good.
I believe we did everything right, Tulia, everything. I don't think there's not anybody in jail that don't deserve to be there.
But in early 2003, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that Freddie Brookins and 3 other defendants were entitled to hearings to review their convictions. This was the break the defense team had been waiting for.
For the very first time in open court in Swisher County, we're going to have the opportunity to present all of this very significant evidence that we've been able to collect now and put it into open court on the record.
Freddie Brookins began to dream about life on the outside.
When I get out of here, I plan on going, hopefully, to Amarillo College. I'm going to find some school to go to. I want to go and study business and, do what I should have been doing a long time ago. But I have a lot of goals set.
Finally, in March 2003, justice hung in the balance in Judge Ronald Chapman's courtroom.
Good afternoon.
As the hearing progressed, the undercover investigation was ripped to shreds. In the middle of the hearings, an unprecedented development. Prosecutors recommended that the court drop charges against all 46 defendants. Judge Chapman later said, quote, Coleman's repeated instances of verifiably perjurious testimony render him entirely unbelievable under oath, end quote. The momentum for the defense continued.
Seated, please.
3 months later, Judge Chapman announced that he was freeing the Tulia defendants on bail, pending a final decision by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals.
The court has concluded that the ends of justice would be met by granting the bonds requested.
Technically, the convictions remained on the books, and the defendants could find themselves back in jail. But for now, there was jubilation.
Following a dramatic hearing at the Swisher County Courthouse today, retired District Judge Ron Chapman granted bail and ordered the immediate release of 13 individuals who were wrongfully convicted of drug charges in Tulia, Texas.
I'm overwhelmed.
Out of prison and back with his family and friends, Freddie Brookins called his release a blessing.
Boy, well, I think my arms are tired, you know, from hugging. But I probably hugged at least about 100 people, at least. Might have been more than that.
It wasn't a total victory. Not yet. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had yet to weigh in, but the momentum for justice was too great. In August 2003, Texas Governor Rick Perry announced a full pardon for all of the Tulia defendants. With the stroke of his pen, they were free. And the nightmare that had begun 4 years earlier in a massive early morning raid was finally over.
We did what the district attorney should have done before he prosecuted one damn case. We went and investigated what happened.
For those who were part of the story, Tulia is only the symptom, not the disease.
Lots of Americans, they've climbed onto this bandwagon of being in favor of law enforcement. They've climbed on to this campaign of hating crime and criminals. And by climbing onto that campaign and getting caught up in the kind of fervor that's generated by it, they've forgotten all about carefully applying the rules, hard rules that we have.
The fact that innocent people were railroaded, the fact that an incompetent investigation was conducted, the fact that people were just almost in a knee-jerk way convicted and sent to prison. I don't think there's anything unique about that at all.
As for the players in this drama, Tom Coleman's last job in law enforcement ended amid allegations of sexual and financial misconduct, and his testimony in Judge Chapman's courtroom earned him an indictment for aggravated perjury. Sheriff Larry Stewart is now working with activist Randy Credico and community members to foster better race relations in Tulia. Prosecutor Terry McEachern is still in Swisher County. His fate will be determined by the voters on Election Day. In the end, it took more than 3 years to right the wrongs of Tulia. But to those who say our system of justice ultimately prevailed, there is a final cautionary note.
This is a story about the collapse of the criminal justice system in a place called Tulia in Texas. I mean, if it wasn't for the media spotlight that was put on this story, these folks would still be rotting in prison.
The defense lawyers and activists who shined a spotlight on this story have taken little comfort in their victory. The fear is that every day in cities and towns across America, there are more cases just like this one. Collateral damage in the war on drugs. I'm James Curtis. Thanks for joining us.